So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that since I am near what is now known as Ottawa, I'm on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. And and we're also happy to have a large number of participants today joining us from a variety of locations across Canada, as you just saw from the Mentimeter exercise. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the traditional Indigenous territory you find yourselves in and also acknowledge it. So my name is Matthew Beckner, and I hope many of you know me, and if not, it's nice to meet you. I work for the Science and Technology branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I've had the privilege of working with a phenomenal team of people from a variety of organizations to bring you the powerful site that we call the Canadian Conservation and Land Management Knowledge Portal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the CCLM is before we launch into our seminars. So this CCLM was constructed back in April of 2020 and has been live since that date. We hope by now you've at least heard about it, but even more importantly, used it in some way. Work for the CCLM started much earlier in 2019 when 5 collaborating organizations came together to address a lack of a centralized place to share and exchange information and learnings in conservation and land reclamation. So this all began with Ducks Unlimited, and Bev Gingras on the call, and she's one of our founding members, and you'll meet her in a moment. She was chatting with me one day, and we know each other way back from both of our early days with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And she was expressing that Ducks Unlimited really needed a portal to share information about best practices for working in and around wetlands. And I said, well, hey, Bev, I just started with the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium, and we're going to need a portal too to do the same sort of thing. Through further discussions with other people that we knew who are also seeking to put the information out there concerning the topics they were most closely related to, we discovered that there was going to be tremendous power and efficiency by coming together and saying, let's not just build a boreal caribou portal or a wetland portal. Let's come together, pool our funding, pool our resources, and make something much bigger, and then really design it from the beginning that other people can plug into if they fall under that same umbrella of conservation and land management. Let's do this. Let's make this big. Let's make it something that's not going to disappear in a year. So our founding members, as I mentioned a moment ago, so I'm Matthew Beckner with the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium, and I work for Environment Climate Change Canada. But we also have Natural Resources Canada, and Cataline McAfee's on the call today. Give a little wave, Cataline, and she's with the Canadian Forest Service. We also have, as I mentioned, Bev Gingras from Ducks Unlimited. We have Bonnie from Innotech and others. We have Bonnie's brought with her team today from Innotech Alberta. And we also have Kevin and Rael from the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, or NAIT, and that's the Center for Boreal Research. But we couldn't have done all of this without some of the support provided by others. So I'd like to also thank the Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, or COSIA, also Alberta Innovates, Grand Prairie Regional Innovation Network, and Fuse Consulting, who are our project managers, and so much more. So the result of this phenomenal collaboration that has been taking place for the last couple of years has been this powerful go-to site for all things related to conservation and land management. A lot of times you can find peer-reviewed literature, you know where to look for those sorts of things, but where do you look for the multitude of other sources of information like gray literature or reports or peer-reviewed materials or best practices? Our Indigenous communities across the country are homes to very impactful Indigenous knowledge, but that Indigenous knowledge, you access that a different way. You don't access that through Web of Science or whatever the portal is now that people are using for peer reviewed. So what we are hoping to do with this portal is to develop a way to access all of that information that isn't available, through these other more peer-reviewed ways of doing things. So now what we've grown to is over 1,200 resources, and we still fully acknowledge that is a small number. We want that number of resources to go through the roof. And so that's where we are now, is we're really in that stage of building up our resources. But we also included an interactive map of boreal caribou projects across Canada. And without getting too much into the details, I'd really like to invite my good friend and colleague, Bev Gingras with Ducks Unlimited, to tell us a little more. So thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. I was beginning to worry you were going to steal my thunder, as you
Never.
usually do. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining. So thrilled that you're here, and we're so thrilled that we're able to come together as a collective conservation-minded people and have these great discussions today. So I just wanted to mention a little bit more about the CCLM in terms of its power through partnerships. So many of us know that collaborations are a really important part of our conservation work, but I think in fact it's probably the most essential tool that we have for conservation. We face a growing number of environmental and social issues, and we can't address these issues working in isolation. We are so much stronger working together than we are working apart. And I think the CCLM is a really good example of a highly successful collaboration working towards some common goals. So we started with these 5 different organizations, and we worked together, and in doing so, we've been able to pool our funds to share the costs of the development of this platform. We've leveraged our past learnings and the scoping that we've done to date. We achieve a critical mass audience to be effective through combined communication efforts. And the portal has been live for over a year, like Matt mentioned, and the resources and the viewership are continuing to grow. So just this last year, we've had over 12,500 visitors visit the site. And like Matt mentioned, over 1,200 resources are in their site, and there's over 150 projects on the boreal caribou interactive map. So it's really exciting. We've got a good start, but we know that there's more work to do, and now marks the start of an exciting new chapter with the CCLM as we set our sights on promoting the portal and mobilizing the information housed in there. And today marks the first of a recurring seminar series where we will invite speakers to discuss key topics in conservation and land management. So very excited. Welcome everybody. And I'm going to introduce to you Christy Burke from Fuse Consulting. Fuse Consulting has been our project manager on this site, and Christy's going to talk to us about some housekeeping things. I know we're already behind time, so take it to you, Christy.
You bet. And I'll do this really quick, everyone. Most of this, everyone probably knows, as we're all pretty acclimated to the world of Zoom. Just so you know, participants other than our speakers are muted throughout the presentation. You have the ability to unmute yourself during our question period. If you have a question during our question period, you can use the raise your hand function, and our moderator will call on you and you can unmute yourself, or you can also type your question into the chat. We encourage you to change your name in your profile, so it helps our moderator identify who you are and direct any of your questions. You can do that just by clicking on the picture of yourself and those 3 little dots in the top right. If you have any technical difficulties or questions, you can message Riel. You might see her at the top, CCLM IT support, and she can help you out. Just send her a message. And we will be hosting a networking session after the presentations. All are invited and encouraged to attend, and we'll give you direction at the end what that will look like. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Matt to introduce our speakers.
Great, thanks, Christy and Bev. So as we said, we're very, very pleased to launch the first of what will be a series of seminars aimed at advancing conservation outcomes. For now, we're planning to do 2 a year, but depending on our feedback and how well they go, we might actually increase that number if needed. So today it is our honor to connect you to 2 experts who, though working in distinct fields, have benefited from including knowledge exchange and collaboration within their respective programs. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome the first of our guest speakers, Dr. Ronnie Drever, who is a senior conservation scientist for Nature United. Through his work, Ronnie provides science leadership and technical expertise to Nature United's place-based and climate projects. Ronnie holds a PhD in forest ecology from the University of Quebec at Montreal. Ronnie has a diverse experience in working as a biologist and researcher in several provinces and has contributed to dozens of publications. And today he'll be speaking about conservation through co-occurrence, woodland caribou as a focal species for boreal biodiversity. And just as a fun fact, Ronnie and I are located yelling distance away from one another in beautiful Wakefield, Quebec. So if you're ever in the neighborhood, stop on by and visit us. And with that, Ronnie, I'd like to invite you to take over.
Thanks, thanks, Matt, very much. And thanks to everyone for this opportunity to speak to you today. So my name is Ronnie Drever, and I'm based in the Algonquin territory, near Ottawa, as Matt mentioned. And so today I'll be sharing some details about a paper we published in 2019. That I'm going to put the link in the chat here for for everyone's benefit. You can access the paper directly. So the paper aimed to answer the question about what comes along for the ride when we do caribou conservation. So caribou, you know, are large range. They have the large ranges that they move all over the boreal, and so we were asking questions about when we implement activities to conserve them on the landscape, what else is benefiting from that activity? So just arranging my screens here. So this is a copy of the paper. And so, as I mentioned, the goal was to kind of assess the focal or umbrella value of woodland caribou, particularly for mammals and birds in Canada's boreal. And so we did this in two ways. One is to really understand the spatial overlap or co-occurrence of woodland caribou with the distribution of mammals, birds, and we took a particular look at at-risk mammals and birds. So I'll show you some maps of those distributions a little bit later. And then we asked questions about the other way we assess to get the umbrella value is we used a very sophisticated planning tool called MarkSan. And MarkSan is a landscape model that tries to essentially create or design networks of protected areas, or reserve networks as they're called, to meet representation goals. So making sure that your reserve network captures a full suite of the diversity that's existing in your study area. So in short, I mean, hopefully what you'll get out of this presentation in the next 10 minutes is that caribou really are excellent surrogates for boreal diversity, and their continued presence in the managed forest should be considered as an indicator of sustainable management of our boreal system. This is just a couple of notes on methods here. So we create a spatial data set that indicates a distribution of mammals and birds. And we did that by essentially stocking absence of presence of each of our focal species in this grid of hexagons that were each about 10,000 kilometer squares in size. These hexagons are what we call planning units, basically indicate whether or not a presence of or any given species is present or absent in that planning unit. And then we use MarkSan again to essentially answer questions about whether or not the existing protected areas network can capture this diversity, and if not, what other areas need to be included to meet that representation. And then, so we were similar to, we were also similarly interested in questions about landscape condition. And so we ran a similar analysis that essentially deducted the benefit of any given planning unit, depending on how disturbed, the percentage of anthropogenic disturbance on that planning unit. So really planning units that had lots of disturbance were given a lower importance in this framework. So here's the maps of the species of richness, the species richness mapping. So richness is really just how many species there are in any given location. So in essence, we documented 432 species across the boreal of mammals and birds. And and they showed what's essentially a latitudinal gradient. So there's more species in the south and less species in the north, which is pretty typical of the way that life's diversity is distributed on the planet. And the highest diversity, the highest richness, occurred along a 300-kilometer band in the southern boreal edge, with really high diversity in, as I said, in that kind of ecotone between the boreal forest and the temperate forest down south, or the prairies just south of that. The caribou distribution captured about 90% of the boreal mammals and birds. So really, this is kind of the key finding that we really if we look to caribou, we can conserve a lot of the boreal diversity of mammals and birds. Then we asked questions in a similar way about species at risk. So we identified 58 species at risk in our study area that had a less pronounced latitudinal gradient, but had more of a kind of hotspots approach. So really, we saw a lot of hotspots for mammals and birds, and particularly in the northwest boreal. The highest diversity we found was in the Charlevoix range, which is here, as well as the Owl Flintstone range, which is in southeast Manitoba. And then the lowest richness was really further north in northern Quebec and the Northwest Territories ranges. And then so coming back to the Mark's-End results, really, so the optimal network identified that we could we could capture the representation of all the species we identified by the sites that you see indicated here in red in the maps on the right. So 90% of these simulations that we did identified the planting units in the southern boreal from BC really to the island of Newfoundland, as well as some in the northern boreal extent in the western shore of Hudson's Bay in Quebec and Northwest Territories. Together, all those sites could capture the full diversity of our species list. When we essentially deducted the kind of the importance of sites that have been heavily industrially disturbed, we find a slightly different pattern. Really, a lot of the northern part of the boreal becomes more important because of its intactness and low footprint of industrial disturbance. But also large parts of the northern boreal, some in the boreal distribution in the Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and Labrador become important as for representing boreal diversity. So then we asked a similar question, examining only the parts of the boreal that fall within caribou range, and really a similar pattern emerged, where really planting units in the south become really important, and in particular the parts in the Val d'Or, Charlevoix, and Little Smoky ranges become really important in terms of their value for representing boreal diversity within caribou range. And using landscape condition as a cost, i.e. deducting planting units that had high disturbance, again reveals a similar pattern, but with more sites showing up in the north, that you see northern Ontario there is becoming more important. But one of the things that was important to kind of understand here is that a lot of the sites in the south of the boreal caribou range really became irreplaceable in the Mark's-End speak, because it didn't matter how disturbed they were, really because of their ability to represent species that were found nowhere else. They just needed to be part of a representative reserve network. So in terms of conclusions, efficient networks of protected areas should include the species-rich areas in the south of the boreal extent, as long as alongside northern areas where you have rare species only found in those locations. The value of caribou for representing boreal diversity and richness should be included or should be understood when considering and in particular, the landscape condition should be included when I'm trying to understand the value of different areas. And then boreal caribou ranges offer many opportunities for multi-species recovery planning, with many of these ranges having not only caribou, which is an endangered species or at-risk species, but other species at risk as well, with some boreal caribou ranges including more than 10 species at risk. The value of the southern ranges shouldn't be forgotten in this effort, because these sites are especially important, and in some cases really don't have a substitute in northern areas. And then, you know, those of us that study caribou have understood that the range of these animals is receding to the northern locations. And as we lose sites in the south that have caribou, we're also losing the ability of caribou to represent boreal diversity. So this is something to really keep in mind. And just to offer a couple of reflections on collaboration, which is the theme of this this webinar. So I've had the pleasure of engaging in many collaborations through my career. Most notably in one recent paper I worked on that had 38 different researchers and 16 different institutions. And really, I can't understate the value of partnerships and collaboration. I think having collaborations afford a way to understanding conservation and really any problem, because they bring in a diversity of perspectives, and that increases the value of the information, the robustness in the information, and the applicability of the information. And so for that, I think we need to start valuing partnerships themselves as ends, really just a simple means to achieve a project. And so really, if you're seeking to leverage change, you should sort of you should look to the diversity of partnerships as sort of as an indicator of the value of your effort. But it's not without costs. Building in collaborations that involves, you know, you need to account for the time that it's going to take to do all that sort of relationship building and trust building. And then, you know, a lot of lessons that we all learned in our group projects in grade school apply here. You know, we need to you know, exercise our muscles of facilitation, active listening, you know, approach problems from an interest perspective rather than a positional perspective, be able to compromise. And so, you know, the type of things that we did as kids, you know, in our school projects, where we thought carefully about who you're going to work with and avoid collaborators that can't, you know, play nice, if you will, that they're there just for a free ride, or they're overly critical, or in some cases are just not good people to work with, because so in essence, all those lessons are really important, I think, and have been helpful to me as a scientist working in a collaborative setting. So thanks for your time and your attention.
Ronnie, thank you so much. That was really excellent. I think it's important what you just said there at the end too, just not acknowledging just the bonuses of going into collaboration, but also to be aware that collaboration can sometimes be challenging, right? But I think that you and I at least would agree that the challenges are definitely overcome by the benefits of collaboration. So we have a few minutes now for some questions that may have come in, or if anyone on there. Sarah, I'm going to hand the mic over to you to handle the question asking period. If you can just let me know if any came in.
So there's no questions in the chat right now. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I think someone will unmute you and you can ask your question out loud if you'd like. But maybe while everyone's doing that, I'll just ask a quick question. So I don't have a lot of knowledge with caribou. So I was just wondering, given how important some of those the southern areas of the boreal are for caribou and diversity, are there like a lot of conservation efforts going on right now in those areas, or could you speak to that a little?
There are definitely conservation efforts going on in those areas. It's a difficult question in some ways of allocating effort because the reward is bigger, but maybe the risk is bigger as well, in the sense that there are some indications that, well, there's really good evidence that a lot of these herds are in deep decline. And so it becomes a question of trying to essentially decide where your conservation effort will reap the highest reward. The rewards are highest in the south, as I mentioned, but maybe the probability of success in terms of the probability of persistence of these animals may be higher where the industrial footprint is lower.
Thank you. It looks like Christy McDonald has her hand up. I think maybe Tatiana, can you unmute her? Or maybe she can unmute herself.
I think I've just been unmuted.
Okay.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for the presentation. That was really interesting to see. I'm just curious to know, because I haven't read the paper or dug into the results, to know when you were looking at the suites of species to evaluate, other species that for which caribou could be an umbrella species, did you consider or try to filter that list based on species whose core range falls within the boreal, or which are species that are really representative of the boreal? It really struck me, as we've already commented on, how many of those areas that were priorities came out in the south. And I'm just wondering whether there was any consideration given to species which are found there, but perhaps are protected in other places or in other ecosystems for which they're more representative, like edge of range species and that sort of thing.
Yeah, great question, Christy. So we didn't do that fine of a kind of a filtering, if you will, on the species suite. We really just looked at species that had at least part of their range in. So it was really so we took the range maps, and if there was an intersection with our planning units, we counted them in. I think a next step with this work would be to, and this is actually part of what we're doing on a more recent project with Environment Canada scientists is looking at species that are more kind of forestry dependent, and so we can get sort of more fine scale information about the surrogacy value of caribou. But really, I think if you wanted to examine that question in detail, you could focus on species that really are that have the same habitat requirements as caribou. I mean, caribou are known for preferring old forests and requiring old forests for persistence, and that's kind of the big reason that they're a risk, is that we compete for that habitat with forestry and with fire. So understanding other species that have those similar habitat requirements would give you some better answers, and or not some more fine scale answers as about how specific conservation efforts could benefit those species as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, it looks like there was another hand up, but it's gone down. But Matt's hand is up, so why don't you go ahead, Matt?
Yeah, and for those of you who are maybe new to the platform, you can just click on the reactions button and raise your hand that way. But yeah, Ronnie, I was just really curious to know, you mentioned the large number of people who are collaborators on this piece of this really important piece of work. Were a number of them policymakers or involved in the policy world within the various jurisdictions of the provinces and the territories?
Not in this particular research effort. There was one Environment Canada scientist for this caribou work, but the one I was referring to at the end there was a different paper that we published that examined a different question altogether. But that it did involve folks from government agencies, and I guess I'll just do a shout out to government scientists here, because one of the things that I learned through that work is that when you engage in government scientists, you do get kind of a preferential window into policymakers sometimes, and meaning that I think policymakers typically tend to listen to government scientists more so than they might other scientists, so when you engage in those collaborations, you do get kind of a window into that policy making sphere. That is if you're interested, instead of having your work be impactful or being used in policy setting, I see that as a really good way to work.
So Jeanette Dooley says, thanks, Ronnie. I'm wondering if you could comment on how you think that species observations versus ranges could enhance the results of your work.
Thanks for the question, Janet. So I get it. I guess it would be more of a fine scale, as I would see that sort of the next step. You know, boreal caribou ranges are big, often bigger than 1 million hectares. And so having more detail, so this is sort of speaks to the difference between occurrence and range. Where we actually see the animals presently is different when than where they might roam more generally. And so occurrence is you know, really where the animals are responding to real-time situations on the landscape. So I think bringing in species observations, and I'm not sure if the question refers specifically to caribou observations or observations more generally of all the taxa that we examined. But I see that being really important at the scale of the individual range, and making sure that, you know, if you wanted to adjust logging plans, or if you wanted to adjust, you know, target where we should put new protected areas or new protective measures, that understanding in a very detailed way present occupancy by animals, you absolutely need those real-time observations rather than relying on the more coarse scale range data.
So Felix has asked a question in the chat, and he says, hi, Ronnie. From the study, did you observe interspecies relationships between birds and caribou?
I mean, yes, in a general and a generous way, but not in the type of way that I think maybe this question is aimed at. It's like, where caribou are doing well, are birds doing well? No, this is really, we do have now a list of all the birds that fall within caribou distribution. So which that would be kind of initial answer, initial take on that question. But understanding kind of demographics and how populations vary with one another was really outside of the scope of this work, which is really aimed at a national extent.
Ronnie, I really thank you for being our very first ever CCLM seminar speaker. And I really appreciated hearing your talk and learning more about what you do. So that's great. And with that, we'll probably take a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll come back in 5 minutes to welcome our next speaker.
Thanks, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks again to Ronnie for starting us off with that great talk. Now I'm going to switch over to Maria Strack. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce Maria to everybody. If you don't know Maria, she is a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. She has a PhD from McMaster University, where she studied the potential impact of climate change on peatland carbon cycling. She's also a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Ecosystems and Climate. And Maria has built an internationally recognized research program that investigates peatland greenhouse gas exchange with a focus on managed ecosystems, including disturbance impacts and restoration and reclamation outcomes. Today, she'll be speaking to us about her recent work in peatland restoration and how best management practices can be applied across industries to enhance carbon sequestration. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Maria.
Well, thanks very much. And it's my pleasure to be here today. And I'm going to continue on the theme of collaboration, talking about how long-term collaboration has really benefited us here in Canada in the development of peatland restoration techniques, and how we can now take those techniques that have been developed and apply them to other situations to also improve peatland function. But before I begin, and as we talk about peatland management, I think it's really important to not acknowledge that Indigenous communities have managed ecosystems across the country for thousands of years, And our study sites are located on many different traditional territories across the country. I'm speaking to you today from Waterloo, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And in our research group, we've made a commitment to more fully acknowledge the land on which we work, as well as to incorporate Indigenous communities in discussions of peatland management across the country. I'll also acknowledge that I'm going to talk about a long-term collaboration today. And so this is the work of many people, not just myself, and you'll see some of their names here. And really, this has come out of an over 30-year collaboration with the horticultural peat industry in Canada through the Canadian Sphagnum Peat Moss Association. And I'll talk about some of the ways in which having that continual long-term collaboration has really allowed us to push the science forward. And partially, we've been able to do that through partnership programs with NSERC. And then I'll present a bit of work at the end that talks about how we've been able to move this forward to application to some oil sands projects. So you see some of our collaborators there, as well as the many other collaborators and students that have collected the data I'm going to show today. So one of the reasons that I'm interested in peatland restoration is because in Canada, we have a lot of peatlands. We have about a quarter of all the peatlands in the world. They cover over 114 million hectares, which is 12% of our land area. And you can see the colors there showing different densities. We have very dense peatlands in the Western Boreal, as well as the Hudson Bay lowlands, which is the second largest peatland complex in the world. But me personally, my research focuses on carbon and greenhouse gas exchange. And I don't just think about peatlands then as the area and the many, the habitat and water resource functions that they provide, but really that they represent this huge stock of carbon on the landscape. So Canadian peatlands store between 150 and 160 billion tons of carbon, which, to put in perspective, if this carbon was released, it would be equivalent to over 700 years of Canada's current anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So this is clearly a critically important stock of carbon nationally and globally that we want to think carefully about how we manage, particularly in the face of climate change. And so, as I said, peatlands, basically quintessential function is to accumulate peat, and that peat is partially decomposed plant remains or organic matter, which is largely made up of carbon. So they're functioning as these carbon accumulators. And if we're interested in the rate of that carbon accumulation or that peat accumulation, we can answer that by looking at peat cores directly and seeing how much is there and the rate at which it's accumulating. And we could also measure contemporary carbon exchange at the local scale using chambers as pictured in the center there, or at the ecosystem scale using micrometeorological measurements, the common one, which I'll talk about today, being eddy covariance, which is pictured on the right. And this measures at an ecosystem scale and can give us a more or less continuous estimate of that carbon exchange. So before I talk about peatland restoration, I wanted to provide a bit of a peatland carbon or greenhouse gas exchange 101, so that when we talk about how, what happens during disturbance and restoration, we can understand what effect we expect that to have on carbon exchange. And so, like I said, peatlands are long-term sinks of carbon, and that comes from taking up more carbon dioxide in photosynthesis than is released through decomposition of the organic material. So one of the important plants that we're thinking about, particularly in peatlands that would be used for peat extraction, is sphagnum mosses. They're really good at holding water, and they're also very slow at decomposing. So when they take up this carbon dioxide and eventually die and deposit themselves in the soil, they decompose quite slowly, but the microbes will still start breaking them down and release some carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Depending upon how wet the soil is, or what we often talk about is the water table position, some of that organic material will first be deposited above the water table where some oxygen is available and where decomposition is more effective. But eventually, once it's buried in saturated soils, which have very low oxygen contents, we talk about anoxic conditions, the microbial decomposition becomes much slower. And it's these wet conditions then that help to protect that organic material and keep it stored in the soil. And so the water table position will be important for controlling that. When we're in these anoxic conditions, we'll still have small rates of decomposition, but it can also lead then to the production of another gas called methane, which we know is a greenhouse gas, and also represents a loss of carbon from the ecosystem. And so again, that water table position is going to be really important for determining how much methane we produce, and also whether it becomes oxidized to CO2 as it passes through the soil. That incomplete decomposition also produces some small carbon molecules, which are lost with the water. We call that dissolved organic carbon. And we need to take that into account when we think about the carbon balance. Finally, from a greenhouse gas point of view, peatlands can produce this other greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, but most of our measurements in Canada have shown it's very low, and I won't talk about it anymore today. So from a carbon balance point of view, we need to think about the carbon dioxide that's coming in and the methane and the dissolved organic carbon that are going out. If we want to understand how the peatlands interacting with the climate, we need to think about the balance between the net carbon dioxide storage and the radiative forcing caused by methane release, which also warms the atmosphere. And when we do that, we know that in an undisturbed state, peatlands have a net cooling effect on the atmosphere. And so that's another reason that we want to conserve them on the landscape. So just to put some numbers to those processes I showed you, in an undisturbed state, the net balance of carbon dioxide is an uptake of about 40 grams per meter squared per year. So if we think about sort of 1 square meter on the land, we release from bogs about 5 grams of carbon as methane, some amount as DOC, maybe up to 15, but that on a long-term average, these sites are storing about 20 to 25 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So we can use peatlands for many different things, though, and one of the ways in which we benefit from peatlands in Canada is through the production of growing media. And some proportion of our peatlands then are disturbed for horticultural peat extraction. It's a little over 30,000 hectares of peatlands in Canada. And I just want to emphasize that, you know, when you think about over 114 million hectares, this is a small proportion of peatlands. And I'm happy to talk later, and we'll sort of see some other examples later in the talk, that there's a lot of other threats to peatlands in Canada as well. But in order to extract this peat, we use what's called vacuum harvesting, pictured here, and it requires the peat to be very dry. So that involves installing drainage ditches. We remove the surface vegetation, and then often the surface is contoured to assist with drainage into those ditches. So if we think about what we just talked about in terms of carbon balance, we've removed the plants that are taking up carbon, and we've exposed all of that organic material to oxygen, allowing it to decompose more quickly. So we would expect that the site should become a large source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And this is exactly what we see during extraction, and even after we're done extracting the site, if we do nothing in terms of management. So post-extraction, these sites remain persistent sources of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And I'm showing some data here from a former master's student, Tracy, who worked with my colleague Ian Strack at McGill University. And Tracy set up an eddy covariance tower on a post-extraction peatland pictured here, 15 years after extraction had stopped. And you can just focus really on the blue line here, which is that net balance of the carbon coming in and the carbon going out. And anything positive tells you that the site is releasing carbon to the atmosphere. So in almost every day through the summer and fall period, the site was losing carbon to the atmosphere. And if we add that all together, along with the wintertime fluxes, we know that our site was releasing now, over 150 grams, upwards to 250 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So we've turned that carbon sink into a carbon source. So with this in mind, as well as the loss of other ecosystem functions on the landscape, my colleague Lynn Rochefort, who I think is on the call here today, and the horticultural peat industry in Canada asked in the early 90s, how can we return function to these ecosystems? And knowing the importance of sphagnum moss for storing that carbon, how can we get the sphagnum back? With the ultimate goal of returning carbon and peat accumulation function back to these ecosystems. And so when thinking about restoration projects, it's really critical to have some clear goals so you can assess whether or not you're meeting those objectives. And so the goals of peatland restoration in Canada then are, in the short term, to get the hydrology right so that we can return these important plant communities that are taking up carbon, so that in the long term, we can return that peat and carbon accumulation function. And the strong support of the industry and the partnership with academics led to many trial and errors in the greenhouse, at the plot scale, and eventually at the ecosystem scale that were critical in the development of what we now have, a sort of a made in Canada peatland restoration technique, which is called the moss layer transfer technique. What this involves is some surface preparation where you remove that sort of excess doming to help drain the water into the ditches. Any invasive vegetation is removed, and then often, as pictured in the top right here, some berms or dikes are created to hold back water and distribute it across the peatland. And then some donor vegetation material is collected and spread on site. And ideally, this comes from a site that's going to be opened for peat extraction. In any case, it's applied in a 1:10 ratio. So 1 hectare of donor material is used to restore 10 hectares of peatland. It's then protected with straw mulch, which provides a nice microclimate for the mosses to establish. Often a low dose phosphorus fertilizer is applied, which helps certain species that stabilize the surface become established. And all of this work is done mechanically, which allows it to be applied over large areas. And so the last step is to block the ditches, which will then re-wet the site. This has now been applied at many sites all across the country with good success. So pictured on the right is one of the first large-scale restoration projects that was done in the late 90s. And so here it is pictured 14 years post-restoration. And then on the left, a site in Western Canada at 5 years post-restoration, where you can already see strong, a good moss cover establishing. So we can see from those photos that we can get the peatland plant communities back, but do those peatlands start to store peat again? And part of this we're answering through a world-class series of sampling, monitoring plots, which Lynn Rochefort, along with the industry, has put in place. So whenever the industry restores a site, they provide the information on how the restoration was completed, and permanent vegetation plots are put in place. And through analysis of that vegetation, we know that we sort of have 3 dominant outcomes that can occur. But over the last few years, we've also been able to go back to those permanent plots and collect all of the accumulated biomass that has, or new peat really, that has grown above that old cutover peat layer. So this is the picture that they used on the poster of me too, but here I am holding 19 years of that new peat accumulation in the Bois des Belles site I showed on the previous slide. So this isn't quite the perfect representation of peat accumulation because it doesn't take into account what's happening down here in the deeper soil, but it is a sort of first quick and dirty estimate of whether we're building new peat on the surface. And you can see there's a lot of variation here, but when we take over 800 samples that we've now collected between 3 and 20 years post-restoration, we can see that on average, we have an accumulation of peat, which I've converted to carbon here, at a rate of about 72 grams per meter squared per year. And some of that variation is related to those different vegetation outcomes. And this is some of our ongoing research to better understand what else might drive that variation in peat accumulation. So we're storing peat, but if we take into account what's happening in that deeper soil, are we storing carbon? And this is some of the work of PhD student Kelly Nugent, who worked with Ian Strack at McGill. And she set up an eddy covariance tower at that Bois des Belles site that we've seen some photos of, and measured the carbon dioxide exchange throughout the year in 3 years when the site was 14, 15, and 16 years post-restoration. And what we're looking at here is sort of a cumulative accounting of that carbon from the spring through to the fall. And again, positive values mean it's releasing to the atmosphere, and negative means the ecosystem is taking it up and storing it. And if we follow that sort of trend over those 3 years, we can see that in every year of the study, the cumulative total at the end of the year was a sink, and it was range somewhere between 70 and 110 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And the gray bars here are from a natural bog in the region that has over 20 years of data measured in the same way. And you can see our restored site falls within that range or even on the upper end of carbon storage. So we've done a good job in terms of returning that carbon dioxide uptake. But at the same time, we alter other aspects of carbon cycling. So when we re-wet the site, we actually turn methane emissions back on. So in an unrestored peatland, the methane emissions remain really low because the site is dry. So it's just difficult to produce and release methane. But restoration returns some of that methane flux to a range that is similar to natural peatlands that we've measured across the country. On a positive note, though, it reduces dissolved organic carbon losses, and this is largely due to a reduction in water loss by blocking up the drainage ditches. So what I'm showing here are the concentrations of dissolved organic carbon in the water and then the total loss from the ecosystem. And so extraction actually enhances or increases the concentration of dissolved organic carbon through enhanced decomposition. And restoration seems to increase the concentration even further because we get a lot of plants regrowing on the site that are adding carbon to the soil. But the overall export of the dissolved organic carbon declines because we blocked the ditches, so the water leaving the system is low, and so that carbon is actually held on site. So we can put all of those numbers together, that carbon dioxide sink, those methane emissions and dissolved organic carbon losses, and see that our restored site was indeed a sink of about 60 to 95 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So we're very confident now in saying that this method within about 10 to 20 years post-restoration can return a peatland's carbon sink function. And so we're working now to work with other industries on other disturbances to see how we can apply some of this restoration know-how to improving peatland restoration in other cases. And I'll just quickly go through an example from the Alberta oil sands. And so I'm just showing here the peatland distribution in Alberta and the distribution of oil sands deposits in the province. And what should be striking is that some of the densest areas of peat deposits also happen to be where the oil sands are located. So often the development of oil sands resources leads disproportionately to the disturbance of peatland area. And I'm going to talk today about in situ oil sands extraction, which involves the creation of well pads and has potentially led to over 100,000 hectares of well pad disturbance on peatland ecosystems alone. Now, the restoration of a well pad is a little more tricky than an extracted peatland because we also have to deal with this well pad material that's been put in place during the oil sands extraction. And so in this example, that was done through what we're calling the burial under peat method. Some of that mineral material is removed back to the borrow pit, but then the remainder is peeled up using the geotextile liner underneath. Some of the peat is removed, and then that clay or mineral material is placed down to get the right elevation of the surface. And then that peat is replaced on top and leveled to be at an elevation similar to the adjacent peatland. And then in this case, the site was revegetated using that moss layer transfer technique. And you can see the spreading of the material in this picture in the middle here, and then the straw mulch being applied. And some evidence of good recovery after 3 years. And I'll just show that in another way. Here's the whole well pad the summer after the groundwork was done. And then the following summer, you can see good cover of wetland plants coming back. And then 3 years later, here's my former master's student, Alexandra Engering, standing on the site, and you can even see some moss and shrub cover returning in the foreground here. So without going into too much detail, just to say we tested different ways of removing that pad and different ways of revegetating, and then monitored the plant community, the water table, and the carbon exchange. And we can see that over, between years 2, 3, and 4 post-restoration, a strong recovery of the plant cover, vascular plant cover, to similar or higher than our natural reference sites. and a slower recovery of moss, but getting up to a range by year 4 that's similar in this bar here to what we see in those horticultural restored sites. So suggesting that at these well pad sites, we've also been able to put it along that same trajectory that we've seen in the horticultural peat sites, suggesting we're on a good trajectory towards carbon uptake. And so not surprisingly, by year 4 here, we saw a net carbon dioxide balance in our well pad that was similar to the understory of the adjacent peatland. And so in addition to that example I've shown you, this moss layer transfer technique has now been applied in Europe to also restore former peat extraction areas. We've used it on constructed fens built in the oil sands mining area. It's been used directly on mineral substrates on the well pads and road restoration, and with the burial under peat technique for road restoration. So in conclusion, from a peat extraction point of view, we know that peat extraction alters conditions on the site that leads peatlands to become carbon sources. But we now have a peatland restoration technique by moss layer transfer that can return that carbon sink function relatively quickly, particularly in a lifetime of a peatland in about 10 to 20 years. And our early results applying this method to other disturbances are also promising. From a collaboration, I just want to say that, having this long-term collaboration with industry has been incredibly valuable in developing this restoration know-how. It's allowed for the really needed trial and error that's needed when developing restoration techniques. It's allowed for learning from failures, which is also really critical and is going to happen when you're doing something that no one's ever done before. And it's provided the ability to have long-term monitoring so that we can really assess whether what we think as early success has led to those outcomes that were our goals when we started. And the industry has also been really supportive in our use of reference ecosystems. These are natural ecosystems so that we can understand whether we're pushing our restored sites towards those desired outcomes, but it also allows us to build our ecological knowledge that we need in order to feed back into restoration and develop adaptive management strategies. So I showed many references today, which you might be interested in, and they're all shown here. And if you contact me, I'm happy to share any of those with you. And I think we should have still a bit of time for questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Maria, for your great presentation. I saw lots of chit chat going on and in the chat box, and Sarah's been moderating. So Sarah, I'll turn that over to you.
Okay, sounds good. There's a lot of questions in the chat, so we'll just kind of go down in the order they came in, and we'll see how many we can get through. So Matt was wondering if recent and increased fire events have had an impact on peatlands and CO2 release events.
Sure. So yeah, definitely peatlands in some situations can be a little bit protected from fire, but what the research has shown is that, as we've had increasing wildfire occurrence and severity, particularly in the Western boreal forest, that peatlands tend to burn at the same, the increase in peatland burning has happened at the same proportion. One thing that we do know, though, is that restoration of peatlands can be also a really important way of reducing their risk to fire. So when they're dried out during extraction, and if they're sort of left that way after the extraction is done, they're at a huge fire risk because that sort of thick fuel layer is just kind of exposed to oxygen and is really dry. So peatland restoration has that additional benefit from sort of protecting that carbon store.
There are a few comments in the chat regarding Indigenous communities. Mamoon had noted that there are some concerns from Indigenous communities related to peat harvest, and was just wondering if you had any comment on that.
I think that, I think decisions about what should happen when there's sort of new proposals for peat extraction need to be taken with feedback from all of the relevant stakeholders. So I can't really say from a specific decision point of view what's the right or wrong decision, but I think that that's important, and that all of the concerns about how that land is managed need to take those different views into account.
Awesome. There was a question from Maria, and she was wondering how Tracy measured or estimated wintertime fluxes from the peatlands.
Yeah, so in that case, we actually did run the eddy covariance towers right through the winter. So we had a continuous estimate, at least for the carbon dioxide. Flux, the methane sensors are still a little bit power hungry and finicky and a bit harder to run over the winter, but the carbon dioxide balances that I showed for both of those, the extracted and the restored sites, were a more or less continuous eddy covariance run even through the winter.
So Ronnie had asked a question. He was wondering how large the restoration sites are that you're working with.
Sure, yeah, so it really depends, Ronnie, on the site, because there'll be sort of sectors that the industry is done with at a given point in time. So, you know, they could be sort of starting at 10 hectares, but up to, you know, now sort of working 40, 100 hectares at a time, restoration. So it really depends on the area that the industry has that they're done with. And then part of it is a little bit also determined by their own drainage network and what makes sense that could be restored at one period of time.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Maria. And again, there'll be an opportunity to have a more informal discussion with Maria a little later. But right now, I'd like to turn it over to Christy Burke. So she's going to give us a presentation about the CCLM, and Christy is the Knowledge Exchange Program Coordinator for Fuse Consulting. And as part of her role, Christy is the CCLM Coordinator. All right, so Christy is going to be talking about advancing knowledge exchange for conservation success, and we'll be telling all of us a bit more about how you can get involved with the CCLM.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And hello to everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar and for our speakers. I'm going to take just a few minutes today to talk about some of the principles of knowledge exchange that are really integral to the CCLM and the conservation work that you are all involved in across Canada. I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the features available on the CCLM and also tell you a bit more about how you can get involved. So let's dive right in. So to connect people to the best available information, a key goal of the CCLM network is to facilitate knowledge exchange. And when we're talking about knowledge exchange, we're talking about a two-way exchange of information between the knowledge creators and the knowledge users. So knowledge creators can be a really diverse group of people and can typically include researchers from a variety of sectors, such as academia, government, and industry, as well as members from our Indigenous communities who really bring generations of really rich knowledge. Knowledge users typically include land managers, policymakers, or other decision makers. And what's really important about knowledge exchange is the process. It's a back and forth, it's a sharing of ideas and experiences, and it should be mutually beneficial to everyone involved. So in conservation, knowledge exchange is really essential to achieving our common goals. And without it, and without good science communication, some of the best information we have might not be accessible to the people who need to use this. This means it could be at risk of never being implemented, and we don't want good science or valuable knowledge just sitting on a shelf. The idea of putting knowledge into practice is really closely aligned with the why behind the CCLM. And this statement, to inspire people to make the best land use and planning solutions with the best available information, was co-created by our collaborators at one of our visioning sessions. And the collaborating organizations really believe in this statement, and it's the core reason or motivation for the individuals involved in the CCLM, and likely a motivation shared by many of you here today. So how do we put knowledge exchange into practice? The good news is we can make some very basic and strategic steps to make this happen. The first two steps I have listed here are really important to our knowledge creators. So we want to create resources, and this is taking our knowledge and the information we've learned and putting it into some kind of format that can be shared with people. It could be a paper, a brief, or a presentation, and it's important to make it digestible and targeted at audiences. It could be more than one audiences. A peer-reviewed paper probably isn't what you want to send to a manager, so we have to consider that when we are creating our resources. And we also want to raise awareness. So after we create these resources, we have a responsibility to get them out there into the hands of the knowledge users. Examples of this could include social media, newsletters, presentations, or webinars like today's sessions. The second two I have listed here are especially important for our knowledge users. Catalyzing action. So stakeholders need to use the knowledge they acquire to take tangible actions. This could be things like on-the-ground field trials, the development of working groups, or collaborations. This is where you really need to explore what you can do with this information. The fourth item I have listed is implementing change. And for science to have real impact, it needs to be implemented. And this often means some kind of change at either an operational, policy, economic, or social level. And the final step is something that is really important to everyone involved. And this is where we achieve our desired conservation outcome and where we really reach that collective conservation goal that both our knowledge creators and knowledge users usually share. So focusing on the CCLM, it's really a tool that helps facilitate all of the 5 things I just mentioned. And it's valuable to both our knowledge creators and our knowledge users. And sometimes you're probably going to find yourself in both of those roles, both the creator and the user. But for our knowledge creators, you provide the resources and the CCLM is going to help you share it. We create the place where people can access it and help disseminate those resources to a broader audience. As a knowledge creator, you can also explore the information that's already available on the CCLM, can help you learn and to help you avoid duplication of work and make connection to other people who are out there working in similar fields as you. For knowledge users, you can visit the CCLM and search from over the 1,200 vetted quality resources that are on the CCLM. All of our collaborating organizations put a lot of work into the review and thought into what is put on the CCLM. And this information can help inform the actions and decisions that are important to reaching our conservation goals. So as Matt mentioned, there was about half of the people for that opening activity we did, half the people here haven't explored the CCLM yet. So I just wanted to give you a really high level overview of some of the features. So when you log on to it or go to the URL, you'll know how to use it. So one of the really important things about the CCLM is this powerful search feature that the collaborators collectively built and put a lot of thought into it. We had user testing experiences to enhance it. We have a great keyword search feature. We have multiple search filters that you can use to expand or refine your search. And then there's also a variety of sorting options. And as Matt or Bev mentioned in the beginning, I think it was Bev, we really have this growing pool of resources. We have 1,200 now. We're growing on that every week. There's more going up and we're encouraging more people to get involved. So this pool of resources will continue to grow. It's also a place where you can come and find and share news and events in the conservation world. So we have several news articles that are shared or produced by our collaborating organizations. And we have a great diverse pool of events that's growing, especially now that people are getting better at these online events, maybe starting to move back into the world of face-to-face events. So I encourage you to check back on the portal regularly to see what's going on in the conservation world. And one thing that's really great about the CCLM and that I think the group did really well was they built this really strong relational database that was just improved upon in our phase 2 development that we just finished in our latest round in improvements. So for example, if you're looking at a resource and you click on an organization, you can bring up that organization and have a list of all the resources they've created. And the same with when you're looking at contacts or projects, everything's connected and it really gets you to the information you're looking for relatively quickly. Another aspect that was really important to the group was building this community of practice. It's not just about having resources, but it's about connecting people to other people. So we have contacts listed on the CCLM, so you can reach out to people and learn about what they're working on. We have this interactive map that the NBCKC is leading that's really built to connect you to projects and the people involved and see what's going on visually across the country. I really encourage you to go explore that. And today's session was, another example of us reaching out into the community and connecting people, maybe not face-to-face yet, but we're trying through a webinar to bring interested people and practitioners and those knowledge holders and users together. So we really want to encourage everyone here to think about ways they can get involved with the CCLM. Like you've heard, it's new, we're growing and we're evolving. And there's lots of different ways you can get involved. We've recently developed a bit of a framework to bring on new members, and we're happy to share that with you afterwards. So by becoming an official member, you have the benefits of being able to share your resources, your news, your events, and we have a range of options available and are willing to work with organizations to customize what these would look like. So if you want more information, please reach out to me, and I believe Mel's going to put a link to a Google form in the chat box, and you can just fill it out quickly and say, yes, I'd like more information, and I will follow up by getting back to you.
Great. Well, Christy, thank you so much for that presentation. And thanks for everyone for sticking through right to the very end of our presentations. I hope everyone got a lot of value out of our first ever CCLM seminar series. Just really to echo what Christy said there is, I often feel like I'm selling something when I'm saying, please come join us and find a way to get involved. But we don't make any money off of this. We're just really looking for the best way to become that go-to spot for all things conservation and land management, so that we are coordinated in an approach, and we have all of the people feeding into a collaborative sort of initiative. But with that, I'd like to thank our presenters today. And Maria, I just had to laugh a little bit when you were holding that big pile of sphagnum moss. It brought me back to my honors days where I did my research on nematodes and tardigrades, and I was looking at the things living in that moss. So I mean, and it's just good to be aware that there's a whole world of things that live within that whole thing you're holding, which is also kind of cool. But Ronnie and Maria, thank you again for your time that you put into your presentation. And as a token of appreciation, we're pleased to make a donation to a charitable organization of your choice, and we'll be reaching out with you after today's talk to coordinate this. Thank you all who attended today, and please keep checking the CCLM for more information about our next webinar, which will take place in the spring of 2022.